The Occult Book, A Chronological Journey from Alchemy to Wicca by John Michael Greer, Part 5. 1917, the Thule Society. There had been other societies like it in Germany before and during World War I, but none with so dramatic an impact on the politics of the time, and so infamous an offspring. It began as a Bavarian branch of an earlier German nationalist secret society, the German Norden, Order of the Germans, but took a new name, the Thule Gesellschaft, or Thule Society, to disguise its connection to the older group. Like the German Norden, it taught an explosive blend of Aristotelical racist occultism and extreme right-wing politics. The Thule Society was little more than a year old when World War I ended and the German Empire collapsed. In the same chaos that followed, a communist regime briefly seized power in Bavaria. The Thule Society threw its support to this conservative reaction, organizing a large militia unit and playing a central role in coordinating the counter-revolution that overthrew the Bavarian Soviet Republic in May 1919. Far more important in the long run, though, was the Thule Society's decision to found a political group that would attract working-class members. At first, the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, German Workers' Party, made very little headway. One evening, though, a young Australian veteran who had served with distinction in the Imperial German Army attended a meeting. By the end of the evening, he had decided to join, and he went on to become the party's leader, changing its name to the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or as it is later known, the Nazi Party. His name, of course, was Adolf Hitler. All through the early 1920s, as the party became a mass movement and a major force in German politics, members of the Thule Society assisted Hitler in a variety of ways. By 1925, the society had quietly dissolved, leaving the field to its monstrous offspring. 1921, Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe. It's hard to study ancient Egypt when you're stranded in Britain, and that was the predicament of Margaret Murray, 1863 through 1963. When World War I broke out in 1914, she was an archaeologist and had planned to head to Egypt for a new season of excavation. The war made that possible, and she decided instead to study the records of medieval witchcraft until the fighting ended. In 1890, Sir James Frazer, 1854 through 1941, had published The Golden Ball, which argued that many ancient myths and rituals came from an archaic fertility region. Murray had read Frazer, and he had became convinced that the persecution of witches had destroyed a fertility religion exactly like the one Frazer had described, which worshipped a horned god and met in 13 persons covenants on Candlemas, February 2nd, May Day, Lammas, August 1st, and Halloween. She argued that when Europe became Christian during the Dark Ages, most of the rural poor kept their old religion until it was stamped out by 3 centuries of violent persecution. By the time of World War I had ended in 1918, Murray had begun work on a book on the subject, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, which saw print in 1921. 2 more books followed, The God of the Witches in 1931 and The Divine King in England 1954. By the time the last of those books were published, many historians accepted her theory. It was only after her death in 1963 that a new generation of historians compared her work with the actual records and discovered that Murray had shamelessly manipulated the data, leaving out anything that contradicted her theory and treating details that appear in one or two cases as though they were common. Scholars today agree that Murray's medieval fertility cult never existed. In the meantime, though, her theory finished the process of laying the groundwork for the rise of the new religion of Wicca. 1922, Alfred Watkins discovers the Lees. The country of Herefordshire in England was green, unspoiled, and marked with the traces of past ages when Alfred Watkins, 1855 through 1935, explored it in the 1920s. He worked for a local brewery and went from farm to purchase barley and hops. Traveling by horseback, the automobile was still a novelty in that part of England. One summer afternoon, while riding across Bradwardine Hills, a few miles west of Hereford, he stopped on a high hilltop and noticed something startling. Before him, the relics of Britain's prehistory on the Herefordshire's landscape, standing stones, burial mounds, holy wells, old roads of forgotten date, and the like, seemed to form straight lines. Tracing the lines on the maps confirmed the impressions. In some cases, dozens of ancient sites marked out straight lines across the landscape. Seeing that the lines on the maps often passed through the places and names with the syllable lay, Watkins named them lays. His first and most famous book on the subject, The Old Straight Track, proposed that the lays were the remnant of an ancient system of land navigation. In prehistoric times, when most of Britain was covered with trackless forests, traders and pilgrims needed to orient themselves as they journeyed, and Watkins argued that the lays served that purpose, providing sighting marks for the travelers to follow. When his ideas were rejected by the archaeological establishment, Watkins organized a society, the Straight Track Postal Club, to carry out research on the lays. Over time, Watkins and his fellow researchers began to wonder if what they lay behind the lay system was considerably stranger than a system of navigation on land. Accounts of strange phenomena related to lays took up a large proportion of the club's correspondence in latter years. The turmoil of World War II caused the club to fold, and it was not until the 1960s that other researchers picked up the loose ends of Watkins' research. 1924, Harry Houdini battles fake mediums. By the 1920s, spiritualism had become a familiar part of the religious scene all over the Western world. Spiritualist churches could be found in most cities, and there were also resort towns that catered to the spiritualist trade, attracting hundreds and thousands of believers to summer events that combine recreation with seances. The most successful mediums claimed that the spirits that communicated through them could ring bells at a distance, write messages in chalk on sealed slates, and even manifest hands and other body parts made of a substance called ectoplasm. The difficulty was that many of those claims depended on outright fraud. In 1924, a Smithsonian Institution committee called to investigate the famous medium Mina Crandon, 1888 through 1941, invited Harry Houdini, 1874 through 1926, to join them. Houdini's real name was Eric Weiss, and he was one of the most famous American stage magicians and escape artists, renowned for his ability to extract himself from handcuffs, straitjackets, and even more elaborate restraints. He accepted the invitation eagerly and went to Boston with the others to observe Crandon at work. What he saw convinced Houdini that she was a deliberate faker, using a variety of stage magic tricks to produce the effects that made her clients think that she was communicating with spirits and deflecting criticism with her personal charm. She liked to do seances in the nude and had torrid affairs with several researchers who investigated her claims. Unlike previous skeptics, Houdini wasn't content to put his objections into print. Instead, he went on to the vaudeville circuit, doing performances in which he demonstrated exactly how fake mediums performed their supposed miracles. His campaign to expose fraudulent mediums was enormously successful, and along with increasingly harsh criticism in the media, it helped turn spiritualism from a mass movement to a fringe phenomenon. 1925, the War of the Roses. The United States between the two world wars was a bubbling cauldron of occultism in which hundreds of different traditions, schools, orders, lodges, and other groups marketed their teachings to an eager public. For the most part, those organizations tolerated one another, but there were exceptions. The most colorful was the great contention between the two largest American Rosicrucian orders, the War of the Roses. The trouble began in 1925 when a New York businessman and occultist named Harvey Spencer Lewis, 1883 through 1939, founded the ancient mystical order Rosicruci Amor, which claimed to be the one and the only heir of the original Rosicrucians. That brought an immediate challenge from the R. Swinburne Clymer, 1878 through 1666, the head of the Fraternus Rosicrucis FRC, which already had claimed the same heritage. From that point until Lewis' death, the two orders hurled invective at each other, each insisting that the other was fraudulent. Nor were Omar and FRC alone in claiming the mantle of the Rosicrucians in the United States at that time. The Rosicrucian Fellowship, founded by Max Hendel in 1865 through 1919 in 1907, and the Societas Rosicrucians in America, SRIA, also founded in 1907 by Sylvester Gould, 1840 through 1909, and George Winslow Plummer, 1876 through 1944, stayed out of the conflict but still fielded denunciations from the combatants from time to time. All in all, it was a confusing time to be a Rosicrucian. Part of what made the conflict so heated was that all four organizations taught students by mail. This was the great age of the correspondence course, when millions of students all over the world signed up to receive lessons by mail in countless subjects, among them occultism, and so all four Rosicrucian orders were competing for market share. The four orders still exist today and still offer their corresponding courses. Fortunately, the old hostilities are long past. 1926, the Fulcanelli Enigma. Paris between the two world wars was a hotbed of alchemy and other occult studies. In the bookstores and cafes where occultists gathered, rumors circulated about one who was not merely a student of alchemy, but an adept who had made the philosopher's stone. No one knew where he had gained his knowledge. All they knew was his name, Fulcanelli. Most of what was known about him came from the pages of two remarkable books. The more important was Les Mystères des Cathédrales, The Mysteries of the Cathedrals, published in 1926. Its sequel, Les Demeures Philosophes, The Dwellings of the Philosophers, appeared in 1930. Both books interpreted by architecture of certain medieval buildings as a guide to the alchemical Greek work, in the process displaying an immense knowledge of alchemical literature and a confident grasp of every detail of alchemical theory and practice. Only in 1996 did the mystery finally unravel. In that year, the French author, alchemist Geneviève du Bois showed that Canali was a composite figure. The original draft of Les Mystères des Cathédrales had been written by the famous occult scholar René Schwaller de Lubisque, 1887 through 1961, and then expanded and revised without his knowledge by two other alchemists, Jean-Julien Champagne, 1887 through 1932, and Pierre Dujols, 1862 through 1926. Les Demoures Philosophes had written entirely by those two men. The brilliant insights of those books had thus been the product of three of the best minds of the 20th century French alchemical revival. A further enigma, however, remains. To the end of his life, Schwaller de Lubisque insisted that Jean-Julien Champagne had in fact made the Philosopher's Stone and transmuted base metal into gold. Did Champagne actually accomplish the great work? To this day, no one knows. 1928, Manly P. Hall, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Manly P. Hall, 1901 through 1990, was only 18 years old when he caught the train to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. A few days later, he arrived in Oceanside, California, where the Rosicrucian Fellowship had its headquarters. He soon moved on to Los Angeles, where he found work as a screenwriter and began giving lectures on occult philosophy. The screenwriting soon went by the wayside as his talks on occultism drew growing audiences. Despite his youth, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of occult teachings and a compelling stage presence. In 1923, he became the minister of the Church of the People at Metaphysical Church in Los Angeles, and his Sunday sermons became must-see events for participants in the huge Los Angeles occult scene. A year before, he had begun writing that book that would be his magnum opus. Funded by a bevy of wealthy supporters and lavishly illustrated by the artist Augustus Knapp, The Secret Teachings of All Ages was published in 1928 to immediate acclaim. In 1934, having established an international reputation as a major occult thinker, Hall founded the Philosophical Research Society, PRS, as a modern equivalent of the School of Pythagoras. He traveled to Europe and the Far East to research occult teachings and went on numerous lecture tours around the United States. Between those trips, he wrote more than 200 other books on a galaxy of occult topics and gave weekly lectures at PRS headquarters until shortly before his death in 1990. Some of his other books are widely considered classics of occult literature, but The Secret Teachings of All Ages, the Big Book, as it is fondly called by Hall's students and the fans, stands head and shoulders above the rest, the most important book of the early 20th century American occult revival. It remains influential, and many of the teachings and the ideas it presented to the public remain in circulation even among people who have never opened its covers. 1929, End of the Order of the Star in the East. It had been a long road for Jiddu Krishnamurti, 1895 through 1986, the son of a servant at the Theosophical headquarters in Adyar, India. He had come to the attention of Annie Besant, who had become the leader of the Theosophical Society after Blavatsky's death. Besant convinced herself that Krishnamurti was the next world teacher, a figure on a par with the Buddha and Jesus, and in 1911 founded an organization, the Order of the Star in the East, to promote that claim. Rudolf Steiner was not the only prominent theosophist to quit the society over Besant's increasingly eccentric claims. Two rival theosophical organizations and Steiner's Anthroposophical Society had taken in some of these individuals, and an assortment of other occult groups had drawn others, but the Order of the Star in the East flourished, attracting more than 100,000 members. In 1929, Besant decided that it was time for her Messiah to begin his public ministry, and a huge convocation of the order's membership was called at Oman in the Netherlands. There, on August 3rd, Krishnamurti walked on the open-air stage, looked out over the thousands of adoring followers before him, and proceeded over the minutes that followed to shatter Besant's dream forever. Truth is a pathless land, he told his listeners, and no world teacher or anyone else could lead them there. He denied that he was the world teacher and finished the speech by dissolving the Order of the Star in the East. Krishnamurti went on to have a long career as a teacher of spiritual philosophy, but the Theosophical Society barely survived the debacle. Like spiritualism, it had invested too much of its credibility in failed claims, and it shrank to a small fraction of its earlier size and influence. Other occult organizations rose to prominence in its place. 1935, Dion's Fortune, the mystical Kabbalah. Born and raised in a middle-class English family whose only departure from utter respectability was an interest in Christian Science, Violet Firth, 1890 through 1946, published two small books of conventionally romantic poems in her teen years. 2 years at an agricultural college ended in 1913 with a nervous breakdown. Thereafter, she studied psychology, qualifying as a lay Freudian therapist, and occultism, joining the Theosophical Society. In 1919, she found her most important occult teacher, Dr. Theodore Moriarty, 1873 through 1923, who initiated her into a magical offshoot of Freemasonry. In that same year, she was initiated in one of the fragments of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, taking the magical name Dio Non Fortuna. Later, she turned this into the pen name by which she is still best known, Dion Fortune. After Moriarty's death, Firth, who had been developing her own personal system of occult wisdom, decided that she was ready to begin teaching on her own. With 5 other occultists from Moriarty's circle, she founded a magical order, the Fraternity of the Inner Light, with teachings that drew equally from Moriarty's work and that of the Golden Dawn. In 1928, her writing career began with an occult-themed novel, The Demon Lover. Her most important book, though, was The Mystical Kabbalah, published in 1935. Here she laid out in detail the entire philosophical and symbolic foundation of Golden Dawn magic. This and subsequent books became required reading in most occult schools in the second half of the 20th century. Meanwhile, before her death in 1946, she trained as an entire generation of British occultists whose writings and teachings helped fuel the occult boom that began to build in the 1970s. Her magical order, renamed the Society of Inner Light, remains active, and so do several orders founded by her pupils. 1936, Dane Rudyard's The Astrology of Personality. Born in Paris to an affluent family, Daniel Chenevier 1895 through 1985, was a child prodigy who graduated from college at age 16, published his first book 2 years later, and made a name for himself shortly thereafter as an avant-garde composer. Poor health kept him out of the trenches in World War I. Instead, in 1916, he immigrated to the United States, where he wrote the musical scores for several early Hollywood movies and played an important role in the classical music scene. It was on his arrival in the U.S. that he changed his name to Dante Rudyard. In 1931, he moved to New Mexico, stopped composing music, and plunged into the study of occultism with a special focus on astrology. With traditional approach to astrology, however, left him dissatisfied. He was less interested in foretelling the future than in using the stars to understand the personality, fusing astrological tradition with the insights of modern psychology and philosophy. By 1933, he had begun writing articles for astrological journals, exploring his new take on astrology. And in 1936, he published his masterwork, The Astrology of Personality, to immediate acclaim. In the years that followed, Rudyard's approach to astrology became the most influential current in the ongoing astrological revival, drawing on the same fascinations with the individual's personality that made bestsellers of books by Carl Jung and other psychologists. Rudyard went on to write more than a dozen other books on astrology, and other astrologers influenced by his work took the same approach to astrology even further. In the process, natal astrology, the study of individual birth charts, became far more central to astrological practices than it had been, and many other branches of astrology were neglected. 3/4 of a century would pass before the pendulum began to swing the other way. 1948, Raymond Palmer founds Fate magazine. Permanently disabled by a childhood accident, Raymond Palmer, 1910 through 1977, found solace in science fiction fandom between the two worlds. In 1938, he made the jump from fan to professional when the Ziff Davis publishing chain hired him to edit the classic science fiction magazine Amazing Stories. Palmer's infallible sense for the lowest common denominator of literary taste promptly filled Amazing Stories with lurid and interchangeable tales of brawny space heroes, nubile maidens, and tentacle horrors. Critics sneered, but sales boomed. Like many science fiction fans in those days, Palmer was also interested in occultism and began including occult-themed stories and articles in the magazine to fill space when the supply of space operas ran short. Sales kept climbing, but by 1945, Amazing Stories was dedicating more space to occultism than the standard science fiction, and the readers ladded it up. In 1948, though, his bosses in the Ziff Davis chain told him to drop the weird stuff and return the focus of Amazing Stories to spaceships, ray guns, and alien worlds. Palmer responded by leaving the helm of Amazing and starting a new magazine of his own, Fate, dedicated to true stories of the strange, the unusual, and the unknown. For the first time in modern history, alternative realities had a public forum. Among articles about flying saucer sightings, ghost stories, and tales of the sinister Deros, who supposedly inhabited a world of tunnels far underground, much traditional occult lore found its way into print. Meanwhile, the classified ads in Fate became an important publicity venue for American occult schools. Over the years to come, the mingling of occult teachings and other forms of rejected knowledge in the magazine's pages attracted a following. That following eventually became the New Age movement. 1954, Gerald Gardner's Witchcraft Today. Gerald Gardner's 1884 through 1964 was past 50 when he returned to Britain in 1936 after a career in the colonial administration in Borneo and Malaysia, and settled south of London in the New Forest. In the years that followed, he became a nudist, joined the Folklore Society, studied magic with Aleister Crowley in the Great Beast's final years, and made contacts elsewhere in the English occult scene. That much was agreed on by all sides in the controversy surrounding him. The heart of the controversy was his claim that during those years he initiated into a coven of witches that had existed in hiding in the New Forest since the Middle Ages. According to Gardner, members of the coven taught him their ancient religion, Wicca, later named Wicca, a healthy, life-affirming pagan faith whose members practiced magic and deviation. His books on the subject, Witchcraft Today, published in 1954, and The Meaning of Witchcraft, published in 1959, claimed to present as much of the traditions of Wicca as could be passed on to outsiders, and found plenty of enthusiastic readers. Critics pointed to the complex lack of evidence that Wicca existed before Gardner started writing about it, and noted that the far more straightforward connection between Gardner's claim and those of his friends and fellow Folklore Society member Margaret Murray. None of this had an impact on popularity of Wicca. Over the decades that followed, Wiccan covens sprang up all over the English-speaking world and in some parts of Europe as well. Some of them were founded by people who studied with Gardner and his students. Far more were launched by people who claimed honesty or otherwise to have been initiated into witchcraft through some other channel. All helped lay the foundations for the massive revival of occultism in the last quarter of the 20th century. 1960, the modern alchemical revival. Albert Riddle, 1911 through 1984, was born in Dresden, Germany, and grew up in the thriving German occult scene between the two wars. Alchemy was a particular interest of his, and he met many German and French alchemists in those years, including the mysterious Fulcanelli. As the clouds of war gathered over Europe again, he immigrated to California, where he soon became involved in the ancient mystical order Rosicrucians during the war years. He attended classes in practical alchemy and the Amorc headquarters in San Jose. He later moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, but continued his alchemical studies. In 1960, he founded a school named the Paracelsus Research Society after the famous alchemist and healer, and he published the Alchemist's Handbook, the first widely available introduction to practical laboratory alchemy. Frater Albertus, as he preferred to call himself, made Spagyrics, alchemical herbal medicine, central to the PRS curriculum and provided elementary instruction in several Spagyric operations in his books. Both the school and the book were well-timed. Herbal medicines were beginning to catch a new wave of popularity in 1960, and interest in the occult was also on the upswing. The next 2 decades saw the emergence of a thriving alchemical subculture in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world. By the early 1980s, the Paracelsus Research Society had been renamed Paracelsus College, and Frater Albertus was preparing to found an actual college with its own campus by Gothic-style buildings, supported by a sale of Spagyric medicines. His death in 1984 ended with hopes, and Paracelsus College closed not long afterward. By then, though, alchemy had resumed its traditional place among the major disciplines of the occult tradition. 1969, John Michael's The View Over Atlantis. By the time the 1960s arrived, almost nobody remembered Alfred Watkins or the long straight tracks he believed he had discovered running across the British countryside. The cultural turmoil of that decade, though, spurred new interest in many forgotten teachings, and two factors joined to transform Lays from a footnote in archaeological history to a potent cultural icon. The first of those factors was a young English author named John Mitchell, 1933 through 2009, who had a taste for mysterious and solid knowledge of occultism. His first book, a contribution to the booming UFO literature of that time, has been almost entirely forgotten, but his second would not be. The View Over Atlantis reviewed Watkins' theories as combined them with a heady mix of occult teachings, sacred geometry, ancient myths and legends, and speculative history. It would have remained just another piece of occult literature from a small publisher, except for the second factor, the mass market paperback boom. Starting in the late 1950s, book publishers found that the cheap pocket-sized paperbacks could boost their sales to unprecedented levels. At the same time, more and more people felt disenchanted with scientific materialism and began to look for alternative viewpoints. Those two trends came together at the beginning of the 1970s to launch an explosive boom in occult-themed paperbacks. The View Over Atlantis was among the path-breaking titles in the occult paperback boom. It appeared in a mass-market paperback edition in 1971, ran through 2 printings the month it was released, and kept selling steadily for the years afterwards. Michael went on to write many books on related subjects. Meanwhile, ley lines, sacred geometry, earth mysteries, and many other occult subjects found their way into popular culture, where they helped shape the burgeoning New Age movement. 1979, Wicca goes mainstream. The books were published on the same day, October 31st, 1979, on opposite ends of the United States. In Boston, Beacon Press released Margaret Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, a journalistic survey of the American neo-paganism counterculture. In San Francisco, Harper issued The Spiral Dance, an introduction to Wicca by a neo-pagan named Starhawk. Their simultaneous appearance marked the coming of an age Wicca as a pop culture phenomenon. The Wicca that took center stage in those books and the thousands of others that followed them into print had changed dramatically since Gerald Gardner's day. What had been a secretive tradition passed on by personal initiation and concerned mostly with magic changed to a highly public religious movement that anyone could join by reading a few books, and it traded in much of its serious magical content for more familiar kinds of self-improvement. Thus reshaped, it found an immediate audience throughout the English-speaking world. For the first decade or so after, Wicca found its feet as a pop culture phenomenon. The historical mythology created by Margaret Murray and Gerald Gardner, the claim that modern Wicca is the old religion, directly descended from pagan cults of the Middle Ages that had nearly been exterminated in the Burning Times, was treated as historical fact by most of the neo-pagans. Gradually, however, the weight of historical evidence and negative publicity led influential Wiccans to abandon that chain. Similar motives led many of them back away from occultism and began a second reinvention of Wicca as a respectable religious denomination with paid clergy. In the meantime, though, the Wiccan phenomenon in pop culture made it possible for many other traditions to publicize themselves and attract a new generation of students, and many branches of occultism benefited. 1983, Ralph Bloom's The Book of Runes. In the wake of Gardner's books about Wicca, the ancient pagan traditions of Europe became the focus of renewed interest across much of Western Europe. Druids groups descended from Iolo's Morgang's reinvention of Celtic wisdom teachings went public, as did groups that hoped to reconstruct the religious and occult traditions of the Vikings. In the process, the magical and divinatory dimensions of the ruins, all but unnoticed since Johannes Bure's time, was rediscovered and studied among small circles of students. One of those students gave a set of ruins to the cultural anthropologist Ralph Bloom, birth 1932 through present. In the wake of a personal crisis, Bloom turned the ruins of guidance and found them a source of profound wisdom. His work with them resulted in a book and runestone set, which was published in 1983 as the Book of Ruins and became a bestseller. Purists criticized him because he changed the order of the runes, altered their traditional meanings, and added a blank runestone to the 24th runes of the Elder Futhark. Whatever merit there may be to those criticisms, Bloom's work brought the runes to the attentions of an international audience and created a market for other books of the runes. In the wake of the Book of the Ruins, furthermore, publishers began to bring out books about many other methods of divination. During the decades that followed, hundreds of previously unavailable divination systems and thousands of new tarot decks became available to practitioners, and divination changed from an exotic activity practiced mostly by professionals to something that many people did on a regular basis. The growing interest in divination made it possible for other aspects of the occult heritage of the Western world to find students. 2012, the end of the 13th Baktun. The ancient Mayan calendar got little attention except from specialists until the late 1970s, when rumors began to spread through the New Age circles about December 21st, 2012. That date marked the ending of the 13th Baktun, a circle of time 144,000 days long, and articles in New Age periodicals began to suggest that something big could be expected on that day. Toward the end of the decade, the drug guru Terence McKenna, 1946 through 2000, settled on the date as a culmination of his time wave zero theory, which claimed that the infinite novelty was breaking into our space-time continuum. It was until Jose Arguelles, 1939 through 2011, published his best-selling The Mayan Factor in 1987, though that in 2012 became a hot cultural property. Over the years that followed, book after book rolled off the presses into the bookstores, insisting that the end of the Mayan calendar would bring utopia, apocalypse, or a blend of the two, especially after 2008, when many New Agers in the U.S. found out that visualizing prosperity didn't keep them from losing their shirts in that year's real estate burst. 2012 became a magnet for the hopes and fears of millions. Unfortunately for them, those hopes and fears were fastened to a phantom. There were no Mayan prophecies about the end of the 13th Baktun. Like most ancient peoples, the Mayans saw time as a cycle rather than a straight line ending in utopia or oblivion. The whole furor around 2012 was a product of the same kind of wishful thinking that had loaded Masonic fantasies on Jiddu Krishnamurti and expecting the frauds of fake mediums. Thus, the 13th Baktun ended, and December 21st, 2012 came and went without incident. The New Age movement suffered a body blow, though it is too soon to say whether that it would prove fatal to the movement. Whatever the outcome, the occult traditions from which the New Age movement arose are still thriving throughout the Western world.